Dr Lydia Jaeger is a lecturer and academic dean at Nogent Bible Institute in Nogent-sur-Marne, which is an interdenomination evangelical Bible college near Paris. She trained in physics and mathematics initially, including research in theoretical solid-state physics, and then took her a PhD at the Sorbonne in philosophy, looking at the concept of law of nature and religious presuppositions. She's written numerous books, some of which are on the bookstall, and explored the relationship between Christianity and the natural sciences in numerous articles. And she's going to talk to us now on reading the Book of Nature, historical and contemporary perspectives on laws of nature. Thank you very much, Lydia.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the very nice environment that Faraday Institute offers to me from time to time. So I want to talk to you about laws of nature, which is one of my ongoing interests. In fact, probably the interest which brought me into physics, and then a topic I'm exploring at the interface between physics, philosophy, and theology for the last 20 years or so. In fact, the conviction that there is an order in nature is fundamental to science. And since the scientific revolution in the 17th century, natural order is expressed in terms of laws of nature. And I want to give you two quotes. I could give you many more quotes. One quote coming from Newton: "The moderns, having rejected substantial forms and occult qualities, have undertaken to bring back the phenomena of nature to mathematical laws." And in fact, you can't do science without this fundamental conviction. And Einstein speaks in this regard of a kind of faith. And he says, to master the diversity of experience, always aiming for the simplicity and the economy of fundamental hypotheses. In the current, still rudimentary state of our research, the compatibility of these goals is still a matter of faith. In fact, Einstein even speaks of a miracle. So the miracle here is the very fact that nature obeys an order, and an order which we can understand. And science needs such a belief in miracle, says Einstein. And this form of faith is confirmed by science, but only after engaging in science. So you can't do science without believing that nature is ordered, and science only reveals the order of things we have already observed. But you need to believe that the things we have not observed are also ordered as well. So if I hold up this watch, and I ask you what will happen if this watch, if I let it go, you all know, I don't need to make the experiment, you all expect the watch to fall down. And in a certain sense, you need this kind of belief in order to do science, and in order to, especially to formulate precise laws, not just say the general rule that things will fall to the ground, but write down the mathematical equation describing the fall. When you ask how to ground this belief, so after you've started to do science, you can say afterwards, science confirms the belief. But in order to engage into science, you need some other ground. And at the very beginning of modern science, the belief in the Creator grounds this fundamental presupposition of science. Nature obeys laws. And without any doubt, the European civilization where modern science came into existence received the idea of created laws of nature from the biblical scriptures, and especially from the Hebrew part of the Bible. And this is the reason why I want to go into some details, showing you some of the texts in the Hebrew Bible, speaking about order, natural order, law imposed by the Creator. In the very first page of the Bible, you wouldn't find legal metaphors, you wouldn't find the word law, but you definitely find the idea of a created, ordered world. So the age of creation is structured in 6 days, Plants and animals are created each according to its kind. And the text particularly stresses the theme of separation between light and darkness, between sky and earth, between water and dry land. And the divine word plays a particularly important role. 10 times the account refers to the divine word, which gives birth to a structured creation. The act of creation encounters no obstacle, in stark contrast to other creation accounts of the time. There is only one God, and this one God is able to impose order on the world because he is omnipotent. And the text concludes by stating, God saw all that he had made, and behold, it was very good. This theme is taken up later on in other texts of the Hebrew Bible, and it's also taken up in the New Testament. And quite interesting, in the New Testament, the idea of divine word giving rise to the world is expressed by the title of Logos and linked specifically to the second person of the Trinity. So it's in the prologue of John's Gospel, you will find Jesus Christ, or the Son of God, given the title of Logos. Yeah. So Logos is Greek for word, reason. Thus, John the evangelist takes up this Old Testament tradition. He joins it with another tradition in the Hebrew Bible, which we will come back to, the wisdom tradition, and especially the text in Proverbs 8. We will see this text in a minute. So there are two backgrounds, two traditions in the Hebrew Bible, which are taken up by John in his prologue, pointing to the Son of God as the Logos. And this Logos, so in the beginning was the Word, everything was made by him, without him nothing was made. So this is the Hebrew background. And then you have the Greek background as well. So John is writing for a pagan context, and he takes up the notion of Logos, which is a Stoic notion. So the Logos structuring the world in Stoicism. For sure, the evangelist changes the pagan, the Stoic notion of Logos, because the Stoic Logos is a kind of pantheistic, natural force pervading all that exists. Here in John, it's a person, and it's the second person of the Trinity, but it's a concept which could be understood by both Greek and Jews. And so here you have the idea of the eternal Son of God informs the world. So the personal divine wisdom informing the world, giving it a structure which human beings can understand. And I had pointed out to Proverbs 8, but before coming to this text, go back to the Psalms. So the Psalms have it's a very important topic in several of the Psalms, especially the Kingdom Psalms, to show that the world which God created is an ordered world, and a world which is firmly established. So the eternal reigns, therefore the world is firm, it does not waver, says Psalm 93. And you can even find the believer in the midst of adversity, looking to natural order as a consolation. So you can read in Psalm 119, "Forever, Lord, your word is established in the heavens. Your faithfulness endures from generation to generation. You founded the earth, and it holds firm. Because of your judgment, they remain standing even today, for the whole universe is your servant." So the word is established in the heavens. Your faithfulness, so it's God's divine faithfulness guaranteeing natural order. And the whole universe is your servant. So the whole universe, so there you have universal laws of nature. No, not laws of nature in this text, universal natural order. But you come close to the idea of laws in a text taken from the book of Job. So Job is a very interesting book in terms of nature in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, basically, especially to the end of the book, you have chapters and chapters, of kind of zoology and biology and physics lessons, and pointing out God's power over nature and his rule over nature. And here's a text from chapter 28, where you have the idea even of kind of quantitative law. So God determined the weight of the wind and fixed the measure of the waters. When he determined a law for the rain and a trajectory for the lightning and thunder, he saw wisdom and rendered it manifest. He established it and sounded it. What is quite interesting in this text, the measure or the law, the trajectory, applies to meteorological phenomena. There are other texts where you find the law applied to stars, the heavens, and in a certain sense this is less surprising. Although the Hebrew Bible is rather unique in the setting of the ancient Near Eastern texts, that it applies legal metaphors to natural phenomena. But in a certain sense, you would expect something like order for stars, because it's quite obvious, in a certain sense, that stars follow a certain pattern. But it's much less obvious for meteorological phenomena. And what is quite interesting that you find a couple of texts in the Old Testament where you have this idea of God's order, God's rule over this kind of chaotic phenomena as well. So this is not because the Hebrew believers were advanced scientists. In fact, they were not at that point. But they came to this conviction because of their monotheism. There's only one God, one creator, and therefore his order must apply to all the earth. And in particular, we find texts where this order is applied to the sea. So here's the text from Proverbs, selection from Proverbs 8. The other, say, Hebrew or Old Testament tradition feeding into John 1 I was talking about, the wisdom tradition. Here I want to concentrate on the fact that in this text the law is given to the sea. So the Lord possessed me, this is personified wisdom speaking, the Lord possessed me at the beginning of his activity before his most ancient works. When he made firm the skies, I was there. When he traced a circle on the surface of the abyss. When he strengthened the clouds from above, when the springs of the abyss showed their power. When he established his order for the sea, that the waters might not disobey his commandment. When he arranged the foundations of the earth, then I was before him like a master workman. I was daily his delight, rejoicing before him always. And I want to stress this very idea of the order given to the sea, the commandment given to the waters. In fact, the sea in Old Testament mythology is kind of metaphor, a symbol for the chaotic forces which threatens the order human beings need for their life. So if you say that God's commandment applies to the sea, that means that it applies to everything. There is no chaos, there is no dark power which can overrule the order which comes from God's creation. And this is a very important idea because we tend to oppose, in fact, God's rule and natural order. So, in a certain sense, we're looking, I think we are very, very often looking for God's, say, intervention. So for God intervening in the world, we look for places for God's action where we don't have natural order, or where natural scientific explanation comes to an end. In fact, what these texts show that order is grounded in God, and that there is no opposition between God's power and his action and the natural order. So no conflict between God's sovereign brain and the operation of natural law. And now coming to New Testament texts, you have, so it's not about natural phenomena in the context of 1 Corinthians, but it says that God is a God of peace. He's not a God of disorder, but a God of peace. And you have the universal reign of natural law because God's reign is universal. Now, today, science is done without this theistic background. So can you understand laws without a lawgiver? And I can't go into details now of this debate. It's a long debate. I've been working on a couple of philosophers of science for my PhD. So I just want to quote, it's not a proof, but I just want to quote 2 atheists telling us that you can't understand laws of nature without a lawgiver. You would expect this from a theist. But here are 2 contemporary philosophers of science telling us that you can't understand laws of nature without a lawgiver. So the first is Norman Swartz. He's a retired professor of philosophy in Canada. And he believes that the theory that physical laws govern the world is a remnant of the ancient supernatural theory that God spake and nature obeyed. And therefore, you have to do without laws of nature. You have to get rid of laws of nature. Laws of nature are mere regularities for him. He wrote, "It is time to adopt a thoroughly naturalistic philosophy of science, one which is not only purged of the hand of God, but also purged of its unempirical later-day surrogate, namely nomological necessity." Nomological means referring to laws. So here Norman Swartz tells us that speaking of laws of nature, believing in something like legal structure in nature is a kind of hangover from the theistic beginning of modern science, and we have to get rid of it. Example, a very prominent example, is the American philosopher Nancy Cartwright, living in for her thesis that the laws of physics lie. In fact, the laws of nature only supply, in her opinion, an adequate description. Nature as a whole resists any universal description. The fragmentary and partial character of the natural order. So Nancy Cartwright was one of the authors I worked on for my PhD. The role that religious presuppositions play in the contemporary debate on laws of nature. And I had picked out Nancy Cartwright and three others, philosophers of science, just because of their importance in the contemporary debate. When I started my research, I had no idea what kind of beliefs, religious beliefs, they had, and if these beliefs played any role in their philosophy of science. And so I started out reading Nancy Cartwright, and I realized that in her writings, from time to time, she used theological metaphors for laws of nature. And she was talking about laws of nature. And so I was wondering, is this just a kind of symbolic language? Is this something, has it a deeper significance? But I couldn't find any clues, in fact, in her writings to decide this. And then she came to a conference in Paris, and I thought, okay, so I live in Paris, I thought, this is my chance, I have to get and meet her. And so after the talk, I went up straight to her and asked her straight away if we could talk to her about her work. I was doing my PhD on this, and so we had lunch together. And you can't really, at least not in the Western world, you can't really start a discussion by by asking somebody, do you believe in God, and does it have any influence on your philosophy? So I thought, okay, so I'm going low profile, so I just show her that I've read her work and ask her specific questions on this or that. But then I thought, okay, you don't know if you will meet her again, so you have one chance this lunch, and you have to get to the heart of your question. So after about half an hour, I came out with the real question I had on my mind. And so I asked her, what about these theological metaphors in your writings? And then she said to me, yeah, this is more metaphors. I really believe that you can't understand laws of nature without believing in God. And in fact, it's because I'm an atheist. I am combating laws of nature all these years. And that was quite stunning. And in fact, she later on invited me into her home, and very friendly welcome, and I had a fabulous weekend, spending hours of discussion, and she confirmed this. And then, in fact, later on, she wrote on it, and here's a quote from one of the texts, that was after our discussion, where she says, none of the contemporary accounts of laws can make sense of laws of nature without God. And in fact, I found one or two quotes in, say, rather obscure writings of her, not main books, but say in this or that book review, confirming the fact. And so she said, here, you can read, I think, says Cartwright, that the concept of law, there is a little too much of God. We try to fitness the issue with possible words, fictive regularities, and ceteris paribus clauses. If you don't know what these are technical, say, ways to deal with laws of nature. But in the end, she writes, the concept of a law does not make sense without the supposition of a lawgiver. So to prove that you can't have laws of nature without God, I would argue that you can't. But I haven't provided you with any argument. I'm just giving you two atheistic philosophers of science claiming it. But then the question is, can you do science without laws of nature? Norman Swartz, Nancy Cartwright think you can. Once again, this is a huge topic. Many discussions are going on. My short answer to the question is no. This is my conviction. Once again, I'm not providing any argument for it. That's just pointing out two difficulties. So if you want to do without laws of nature, it's very difficult to distinguish between accidental regularities and law-induced regularities. So I'm going to give you an example. Take the two general statements. All golden spheres have a diameter of less than 1 kilometer. Certainly true. There's not enough gold in this universe, at least not on this earth, so any gold in our easy reach, that we could produce a golden sphere of a diameter with more than 1 kilometer. But in another sense, you could. The laws of nature doesn't tell you that you can't produce a golden sphere of this diameter. But take the other statement, exactly similar in form. All uranium spheres have a diameter of less than 1 kilometer. Here, it's not that you don't have enough material to build these spheres, but the laws of nature forbid you to do it. You can't do it because uranium is unstable, so you can't make such a large sphere. But how would you explain the difference between these two situations without referring to natural order, without referring to some kind of law of nature? Okay, here's the example. And then another related difficulty, how to justify counterfactuals. So counterfactuals are affirmations about what is not happening, but where you still are pretty sure to know what would happen if you did it. So once again, my watch. If I let this watch go, it would fall to the ground. I think you would all say, yeah, that's right. So, but what is the justification for such a statement? I've never made any observations. in fact 2 or 3 times I let my watch go, and then it fell to the ground, but normally I try not to do it because it would harm my watch. So it's all these kind of observations I've made which provide a justification because it's counterfactual. So nobody would say the laws of nature provide this kind of justification. But if there are no laws of nature, if there is no natural order, what is the justification for such kind of counterfactuals? So I think there are difficulties in doing science without laws of nature. I think you can't do away with laws of nature. But once again, I'm not going any deeper into it. I want to turn to another aspect of modern science, very important, which is linked to the doctrine of creation. So the experimental method, experiments and free creation. This is an aspect which differentiates modern science, so science as it took birth from the 17th century on, roughly, compared to Greek science, Greek or medieval science. So in modern science, the experiment is the final verdict. It's not the only. Science is not just about doing experiments and observation, but the experiment is the final verdict on the truth of a theory, And this is directly linked to the idea of creation, because creation, in comparison to other conceptions about the world's origin, puts the emphasis on freedom, on free will by the creator. So, if you take the doctrine of creation, the world is the result of free divine action. The world does not explain itself. It could not exist. The world does not flow from God's nature. God created everything by His will, tells us Revelation 4. God did not create in order to satisfy any need. He didn't have to create. And therefore, creation is different from emanation, which you would find in Spinoza or in Oriental religions. The world is contingent, that is, it is not necessary, it could not exist, and it could be otherwise than it is. And this very specific idea or notion of the world's contingency played an important role, in fact, at the birth of modern science, and is linked to the empirical method of modern science. You find it, for example, in Robert Boyle, who is one of the founding fathers of modern chemistry. And so in Boyle, you can read this: the laws of motion, without which the present state and course of things could not be maintained, did not necessarily spring from the nature of matter, but depended upon the will of the divine author of things. You find it in Newton as well. So Newton, in one of his unpublished manuscripts, so it's the conventions of the time, so I'm putting it slightly into more modern English when I read it, the world might have been otherwise than it is. It is therefore not necessary, but a voluntary determination that it should be thus. And he opposes, for example, Leibniz on this view. And just to give you another quote from Roger Coitz, who oversaw the publication of the second edition of the Principia, he was the spokesman for Newton's view, and he writes in the preface that the laws of nature proceed from the free will of God. They demonstrate many traces, indeed, of the most wise contrivance, but not the least shadow of necessity. These, therefore, we must not seek from uncertain conjectures, but learn them from observations and experiments. And he would even add that who would claim to rationally deduce the sciences must either suppose that the world exists by necessity, which is excluded by creation, and by the same necessity follows the laws proposed, or if the order of nature was established by the will of God, then himself, a miserable reptile, can tell what was most fitted to do. and we can't, because humans are limited, and the divine intelligence goes beyond what we can apprehend. And so these quotes show that Newton's empiricism was closely linked to the idea of a freely willed creation. And in contrast to other conceptions of the world's origins, creation places the emphasis on divine sovereignty and omnipotence. God can do all that he pleases, and it follows, therefore, that the natural order is not necessary, but contingent. God was under no obligation to create, and therefore we can't find laws of nature by pure speculation. We have to go and observe what God did. And there is a famous article in the Mind Review in 1934 by Michael Foster pointing this out. And so I read from this article. The element in nature which depends upon the voluntary activity of God is incapable of becoming an object to reason, or more precisely, an object to reason alone. And so therefore must depend in regard to this element upon the evidence of sensation. The reliance upon the senses for evidence, not merely for illustration, is what constitutes the empirical character peculiar to modern natural science. And the conclusion follows that only a created nature is proper object of an empirical science. And I want to turn to another very striking aspect of modern science and show the link to the doctrine of creation. It's the fact that laws of nature are typically formulated in mathematical language. And modern scientific accounts are more powerful than older ones, precisely because of the mathematical devices used. This is particularly true in physics, my own field, but other scientific disciplines often strive to get closer to the ideal set by mathematical physics. And I think we often take for granted the possibility to apply mathematical rules to nature, but in fact it's a very powerful presupposition of modern scientific practice. And Galileo is famous for having claimed that the book of nature is written in mathematical language. So the book of philosophy, in fact the book of philosophy is the book of natural philosophy, what we would call physics today, at that time was called natural philosophy. So the book of philosophy, or you could say the book of physics, stands perpetually open for our eyes, though since it is written in characters different from those of our alphabet, it cannot be read by everyone. And the characters of such a book are triangles, squares, circles, spheres, cones, pyramids, and other mathematical figures most apt for such reading. The claim that the book of nature is written in mathematical language would be incomprehensible, I would say, to Aristotle, and Aristotle who, in some sense, dominated all Greek and medieval science. Medieval science is largely Aristotelian science. In fact, Aristotle, for Aristotle, there was no place for mathematics in natural philosophy. So natural philosophy is the discipline which looks for causal explanations, which describes why things behave as they do. And so there is a place for mathematics in Aristotelian science, but it's not in natural philosophy. It's not when you try to understand what is going on in nature. The only place for mathematics in Aristotelian science is in so-called subalternate sciences or mixed mathematical sciences, as for example astronomy, optics, mechanics. So they use mathematics, but as a calculation tool. It doesn't tell you how nature is. It just gives you tools for calculation. And for example, in astronomy, in some sense, up to Newton, there was a famous difficulty that you would not be able to formulate Ptolemaic or Copernican astronomy in Aristotelian terms. You had very powerful calculation tools, description of orbits, planets, stars, etc. But these calculation tools could not be expressed in terms which were acceptable to Aristotelian natural philosophy. And then if you believe that the Aristotelian natural philosophy tells you how things are, how nature is in reality, then all this astronomy is just calculation tools. It's not about nature. And then, I'm putting it very simply, but then comes Newton. So this is a very simplified expression of the complex historical evolution, but I think against this background you have to read the title of Newton's Principia. I think it doesn't strike us as very surprising, but it was very surprising for an Aristotelian, because the very title is Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy. But for Aristotle, no mathematics in natural philosophy, no mathematics in describing nature. And when pressed to justify his use of mathematics, not only as a calculation tool, but as a description of nature, Newton would refer to God's omnipotence and wisdom in creation. And here's a quote from the Principia. This most beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. This being governs all things, not as the soul of the world, but as Lord over all. Take another figure, John Kepler, who formulated the 3 laws of planetary motion, which finally helped Newton to formulate his theory of gravitation. William Kepler, writing in his work The Secret of the World in 1596, I shall have the physicists, that is the natural philosophers, against me in these chapters, because they have deduced the natural properties of the planets from immaterial things and mathematical figures. So mathematics allows you to describe the behavior of natural things. And then he defends himself by referring to his belief in the Creator. I wish to respond briefly as follows. Okay, sorry. Here's the word. So, I wish to respond briefly as follows, that God the Creator, since he is a mind and does what he wants, is not prohibited in attributing powers and appointing circles from having regard to things which are either immaterial or based on imagination. So once again, as in Newton, in Kepler, you see the same argument used. God is a rational God. He can look to mathematics in creating the world. And a quote, you would find it in Descartes as well. So Descartes, God has marvelously established these laws. And John Henry sees exactly the same dynamics at work in Descartes' reference to created laws. It's a very interesting article on laws of nature. And John Henry writes this: Descartes, writing as a mathematician at the forefront of efforts to develop the new physical mathematics, proposes precise laws of interaction in physics. He is inspired by the use of laws in the subordinate mathematical sciences, so it's not coming out of the blue. But almost immediately, however, Descartes realizes that he is now playing a somewhat different game. While putative laws in the abstract system of mathematics needed no justification beyond their definition, if they are just calculation tools, you don't need any metaphysical underpinning. But now the new physical laws that Descartes was proposing needed such a metaphysical underpinning. In pursuit of this new metaphysics, Descartes had to consider the nature of God's interaction with the world and turned accordingly to traditional providentialist theology, so providence as a corollary of creation. And what had been devices for calculation now acquired the status of a universal order. And it was God's infinitive rationality and its sovereignty over the world which turned mathematical rules into laws of nature. Okay, my time is nearly over. Therefore, I'm going to skip what I was to say about the material world. Just coming to the conclusion. So, reading the Book of Nature, historical and contemporary perspectives on laws of nature, I just want to summarize our findings. So, we've seen that laws of nature are a key concept of science since the 17th century. The founding fathers of modern science used this concept in order to express their new scientific method. And we've seen quotes from Boyle, Newton, Descartes, you could add others. Second, the idea of law is rooted in the biblical concept of creation by an all-powerful and all-wise God. The Hebrew part of the Bible in particular uses legal metaphors with regard to natural phenomena. The reign of God's law is universal, as God is the creator of everything, all-powerful, all-wise. For sure, you don't have in the Bible any mathematical formulation of laws of nature, but you have the framework in which the modern concept of law of nature could come into existence. Third, laws are used today in today's science without any reference to God. Nevertheless, I've made the claim that it is impossible to understand laws of nature without a divine lawgiver. I have not provided any extensive argument, just pointed to some citations, to some difficulties to do science without laws and to understand laws without a divine lawgiver. Fourth, creation is a free act. This implies that laws need to be discovered by experiments. And Newton in particular grounded his empiricism in his belief that the world is created. Thus, creation provides the framework for the experimental method, which is so important in modern science. And the last point, which I just raised, I didn't have time to develop it. In the biblical perspective, creation applies to everything. There exists nothing apart from God which is not created by Him. Thus, matter is created. And this explains why mathematical laws exactly hold in the material world and not just in a kind of abstract world. But yeah, I haven't shown you that this is in work in Galileo, for example. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Lydia, and plenty there to get our teeth into. And actually reminds me that a question we didn't discuss in the panel discussion last night was, would there be laws of nature if there weren't humans to describe them? I don't know if the person asking the question feels that it's been answered or wants to follow it up a little bit. So are there questions? Right at the very back there, Alan.
Thank you. I am that person who asked that question. That's right. And yes, we've gone a long way to answering that question, but my thoughts were more detailed than that. Thinking about writings of modern scientists, not I am one of them, but I'm a reader of them, the laws of nature are being discovered and refined. But we find that by doing them, getting down into the smaller and smaller parts of the world, we find that the problem of human interference comes into play, and that these observations wouldn't take place without humans, and they wouldn't be the same if we weren't observing them. So we interfere, and because of that, if we weren't here, or before we were here, shall we say, were there still laws of nature? Or could we talk about that? I mean, does it make sense to say there weren't any laws of nature before we were on the planet?
Yeah. We wouldn't be able to talk about them. We're not here. Yeah. I suppose you refer to the quantum mechanical measurement problem. And the way you frame it is, I'm afraid, a very common misunderstanding. There is, in the quantum mechanical theory of measurement, there's nothing about human observation. It's often framed in this way, but and even by physicists, but bluntly spoken, it's a mistake. So you have the theory of measurement in quantum mechanics, don't need any human observer. In fact, an instrument, a macroscopic instrument, gives you all that you need, and it doesn't make a difference if any human reads on the screen or doesn't. So that's for the quantum mechanical part of it. And then in general, as probably most scientists, I'm a realist. So believing that the world is there even if we don't look at it, even if we don't observe it, and that the natural order does not come about because we decide to look at it, that things would behave in the same way if we looked or if we didn't. For sure, if we take a system of which we are part and then we describe the system, then things change because we are part of the system, and then our action has an influence. But the very laws of nature, I don't think, depend on it.
Question? Yes, Jessie.
Thank you. I greatly enjoyed your summary of the biblical text, which you talked about them pointing to laws of nature. One of the ways that many of the biblical texts describe how God relates to creation is that He is ever present, and that God makes it rain, God brings forth fruit from the earth, which seems in some way to contradict this idea of laws of nature, as perhaps is understood in the modern sense. How would you? Is there some way in which the two worldviews can be integrated, or are they very different ways of understanding how the earth works? I mean, obviously, from a biblical perspective, I live in a very non-scientific, in a sense, understanding, or pre-scientific understanding of the world. Sorry, did that make sense?
Yeah, I would argue for a very strong notion of creation. And therefore, being able to say that it's a law of nature, but it's also God doing it, because the law of nature would not be valid if God did not consistently uphold the word. And so in that sense, an expression of God's faithfulness in His dealings. So this is a point I try to make, that we very often and very easily, in fact, we take a kind of deistic view that you either have God or you have nature. But I think if you take creation seriously, you have both, and you can't have God without nature, but you can't have nature without God.
There's a question just.
And coming back to the biblical text, it's for certain. If you look at the biblical data, you have both aspects. So I focused on the text, stressing law, stressing God's word, stressing God's rule. But you have also the texts which speak about God directly intervening, and not only saying what we would call miracles, but even the general course of nature. But I don't think that they're in opposition, and you will find quite a few texts where you would have both types of languages alongside each other. Even in fact in Genesis 1, you have God speaking, and then creating, and then you have the earth bringing about the seeds of plants, Yeah? So even in Genesis 1 you find these two kinds of languages, and I don't think there's a tension if you really have a strong notion of creation. Okay.
In light of the consistency of the laws of nature, as well as the claims of miracles, how can God be faithful to the laws of nature in that sense if he allows miracles that violate the laws of nature to happen?
I very much like C.S. Lewis's work on miracles in his book, and I think there's one very interesting analogy in it, and he gives the analogy of poets. So a poor poet normally would depart from rules because he just can't make the poem without respecting the rules. And then you get the genius, who would also depart from the rules, but to create special effects. And this is the example he gives, or the analogy he gives for God's miraculous intervention. So in fact, you need even natural order if you want to speak about miracles, but miracles are there for special effects, and I don't see why God's faithfulness would not allow any such special effects. But you need a background of natural order even to see that the miracle is happening.
There was two hands at the back there. Just got time for 2 quick questions, and then we'll break for coffee.
When cosmologists talk about the inflationary theories of the universe, they use those to explain why there is this consistency between laws of nature, that everything harmoniously inflated from that one singularity, and therefore the universe has got equal laws everywhere. And another way of saying that is that actually it's not so much a regularity as a quality of the physics. So it's the quality of the physical particles which determines their interactions, and not some law that kind of intervenes. How would you respond to that?
First of all, any cosmological theory need laws. So you need the theory in the first place. And no cosmological theory can explain you why this theory would hold, not even inflation. And then the other is perhaps a more philosophical backup, where I would say, okay, you have inflation at the first instances, but why would you go on with the same regularity after millions of years? So it's certainly not inflation. So there's nothing, it's not a necessary truth that the world will be obeying the same laws tomorrow than it obeys today. And physics can never tell you this. You always need the laws of nature in order to do physics.
I don't understand though why it's not just based on the quality of an aspect. I mean, you could use the analogy of love, for example, between two people. There's no law of love between them, it's the qualities each of them themselves have that establish their relationships, and not some law that intervenes.
Yeah, but then you need to explain the quality. So for sure you can say, okay, I don't want to have these quantum mechanical laws, I just want to have a kind of, Nancy Cartwright tries it, so we need properties, so every electron has the same properties, and she thinks that she can get around the need for a divine lawgiver by a kind of quasi-Aristotelian view that every particle behave in the same way. But this is a law in itself. So why would, say, electron 1 and electron 2 behave in the same place? Either you say, I don't have any explanation, and I'm fine with this. Most scientists probably do it. But if you look for an explanation, I think the only way you can look is a kind of divine lawgiver. It's not a law in perhaps so in a very technical sense, but then it is a law that every electron has this kind of property. So you just switch the need for explanation. By the way, I think Faraday proposed an argument for God's existence from the universal character of electrons, if I remember correctly.
There was what? Is it a quick question?
Yeah, it's actually just a clarification. Your third point there, which the impossible to understand without a divine lawgiver, you can understand a design apart from the designer. So I'm just asking for clarification. You're saying it's impossible to fully understand, really, right? you're not saying it's impossible to comprehend or understand or have a good grasp. You're just saying you're missing a big part of the picture, the biggest part of the picture.
Yeah, explain would be better, yeah.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Lydia. That's really helpful.